Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today for the launch of the Mosaic Economic Project here at the Progressive Policy Institute. I am Crystal Swann, and I'm a Senior Policy Fellow and member of Mosaic Economic Project Senior Leadership Team. A couple things. That's Kathleen Day that you're looking at right now. All right, we're going to keep going. Between 2017 and 2018, only 8 minority women were awarded PhDs in economics, yet economics remains the top social science discipline called upon to testify before Congress and in the media. And we here at the Mosaic Project felt like it was time to have some diversified voices in those spaces, and we wanted to be an instrument for that. Technology, for example, impacts us all, and we use it almost every day. Like right now, we are on a call via Zoom. Who could have imagined this 8 months ago? And yet men hold 76% of the technology jobs and 95% of the tech workforce is white. If you look at the venture capital space, the lifeblood of the tech startup community, a report in 2018 found that only 8% of the top 100 venture capitalists were women, or ventures were funded were women. And from 2018 to 2019, the percentage of funding going to women-led firms actually fell. Many of these stats are post the Me Too movement, when many tech titans and venture capital firms pledged well-meaning efforts to change the narrative. That's part of the reason the Mosaic Project was created. Policy can be a powerful change agent when it's placed into action and moves beyond promise. Our goal is to find, elevate, and advocate for the inclusion and engagement of experts with diverse experiences in meaningful policy conversations, with a particular focus on Congress and the administration, as well as the media. We will provide program participants with the skills necessary to effectively convey their research ideas and their policy analysis to policymakers. Before we get to our speakers, there's a few things we need to do and recognize a few individuals. We have 2 of our founding member companies with us today, Google and S&P Global. We want to thank you for your support. We also want to recognize Amelia Steinbach, who I think is on as an audience member, whose op-ed drew national attention to this problem when she was an intern with Senator Rhonda. Thank you for your voice. And because you'll probably be hearing from them at some point in the next couple of weeks, I want to introduce our members of the Mosaic team: Lori Moskowitz, Campbell Spencer, Jason Gould, Flora Lee, and Kathleen Day. You can learn more about them from our website that we will place the link in the chat very shortly. Now, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kathleen Day, who will give you a brief overview of the project's curriculum and goals. Kathleen is a contributing writer at the Washington Post, where she worked full-time as a business reporter for 20 plus years. She's an author with a new book out from Yale University Press on the history of the US financial crisis. She is also a full-time lecturer at the Johns Hopkins Carey School of Business, where she teaches business communication as well as courses in financial crisis and corporate governance. Kathleen, you have the floor.
Thank you, Crystal. So how will Mosaic work? At the heart of this project will be a set of diverse cohorts, 2 to 3 of them a year, with each cohort having 5 to 6 women selected from a pool of applicants. The aim will be to provide the women in these cohorts with the tools they need to raise their profile with the media, with industry experts, and with policymakers, especially in Congress. We'll have workshops to help them hone communication skills and to provide training, coaching, and practice in interacting with reporters, editorial editors, and congressional staffers. But it won't just be workshops. The program will have funding for research. And research, of course, helps provide what is at the heart of any expert's calling card, what really gives them a calling card, and that's information. Take Elizabeth Warren. She was a virtual unknown in the early 2000s when reporters and Hill staffers from both sides of the aisle started to make a beeline to her door. And that's because she had detailed research on why most people file for bankruptcy. It turns out it's divorce, job loss, and sickness, not really a surprise, but she came out with data confirming that, just as Congress was debating legislation to overhaul bankruptcy law and credit card law, both of which passed in 2005 and 2009, respectively. When I and scores of other reporters first encountered Warren, we contacted her because we wanted the data she had, the information, to run alongside the information the credit card and other lending industries were generating around those bills. Now, not everyone has as natural a knack as Warren does for speaking to the media and to policymakers and for attracting their attention, but everyone can become better at doing that. And that's where Mosaic comes in. In addition to workshops and research money, Mosaic will offer networking in DC and New York for a practical rundown of how to break into what can seem like an impenetrable club, so the women in these cohorts can learn some of the secret handshakes. Information well packaged is essential, hence the media training and the funding for research, but networking is also key. So that's Mosaic in a nutshell. The aim is to bolster the ability of a diverse group of women to provide information and expertise more effectively, and ultimately to have an impact on what people in power think and how they act on what they think. And please remember, as Crystal said, that while it's called the Mosaic Economic Project, the focus is on economics and technology. So a candidate for participation could be an economist or a tech professor at a university or someone like that at a research firm, or she might be an entrepreneur at a tech startup or someone at a venture fund with expertise on how new ideas win funding. If you're interested in being part of the first cohort or know someone who is, you can apply or tell them to apply from our website. And I suppose it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. We'll have to start this virtually, but we'll have the cohorts meeting in person as well as online once the pandemic subsides. So please apply. Thank you. And I hope there's lots of interest. And now I turn it back to you, Crystal.
Thank you, Kathleen. Very informative. We're going to move to our keynote, and it now gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Tammy Wincup is president of Protocol. Protocol is a new media company from the publisher of Politico, whose goal is to arm decision makers in tech, business, and public policy with fact-based news and analysis. Tammy, thank you for being with us, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Crystal. Thanks to you and Jason and others for the Mosaic Project for inviting me to join you today, and congrats on the launch of the Mosaic Project. The idea of really focusing on how to bring more diverse women into the folds of economic and technology is an issue that in many ways has been at the heart of my career, first in workforce development, then in tech, and now in media. And I thought that before I dive into the critical role of media to including more diverse women, I thought it was relevant to quickly share how I came to tech and now to media. I actually started my career in international workforce development. As a young idealist woman in business, I found myself working in South Africa during President Mandela's last years in office in the late 1990s. Our task at the time was, how could you integrate South Africans into the economy who at the time had no formal education credentials under apartheid, but significant workforce experience? It was an exciting prospect, and yet I left after 2 years deflated, as we had certified less than 1,000 South Africans in Soweto, mostly because we had no real way to scale the project. Even then, my mind was thinking about the important role that technology could play to actually scale important social projects like that. So with the dawn of the internet and the first .com bubble, I moved from Johannesburg to San Francisco to join a tech startup in then the knowledge management and application service provider space. Now we call it software as a service, or SaaS tech companies, to learn how I could apply technology to social issues at scale. Fast forward more than 20 years, I've spent the vast majority of that 2 decades focused on actually operating technology software companies, both in San Francisco and in DC, including the last 9 years building a venture-backed education technology company called EverFi. And in those 2 decades was often, almost always, the only woman at the tech table. And so as many of you that are joining on the call from policy or tech itself or business, you know the facts, which Crystal pointed out, many of these as well. While the percentage of women employed across all job sectors in the US has grown to 47%, the 5 largest tech companies on the planet, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft, have a workforce of about 34% women. 26% of computing related jobs are held by women, but just 3% of computing related jobs are held by African American women, 6% by Asian women, and 2% by Hispanic women. And as Crystal already shared, it's a very small fraction of women who actually lead the venture capital space. And 12% of those decision makers at VC firms at funds bigger than 25 million are women. But Black women received from 2009 to 2017, 0.0006% of the venture capital investment. So what does tech media have to do with all of this? What does the story that I tell about moving from economic growth and workforce development to actually running technology companies to now media, what does it have to do with the story that Mosaic Project is focused on? I would argue almost everything. A year ago, I officially left tech to start a new tech media company, which Crystal described, and it is where protocol comes in. From the publisher of Politico, we really came to this idea of protocol because in my years in tech, what I realized is that tech is no longer just an industry. It's not a drop-down menu where you pull in that you're from tech. Tech now, today, is a power center with the real reach and impact of any nation's capital. And so if you believe that hypothesis, which I did and I do, it means that our intention has to be not just to cover product releases in tech or venture capital and financing, but to truly understand and tell the story of the people that make those decisions in that power center and the impact that they're having on business and society. That is the role as a startup founder that we are hoping to do at Protocol and that we are doing, I would argue, pretty successfully from our launch just 9 months ago. So let's talk about the media industry in general. I'm new to it, but I come at it with a lens from tech specifically. Unfortunately, the American Society of New Editors paused their diversity survey this year. But we do have some overall industry data from Pew in 2008, and in May, the New York Times releasing its diversity study. At the New York Times, at the end of 2019, women made up 51% of staff and 49% of leaders. People of color represented 32% of staff and 21% of its leadership. And what about tech media? Well, take those numbers and shrink them even smaller. While we don't have a distinct data set, what we know from the research that we've done in creating Protocol is that those numbers of those who are covering, women that are covering tech specifically, and certainly people of color, are lower. As an example, just last week, I was on a call with Berkeley Journalism School sharing our open Protocol positions. Despite them being a stone's throw away from Silicon Valley, they shared that it was actually hard for their students to get interested in covering tech versus covering larger society issues. Our thesis at Protocol is that they're intertwined, is that tech is no longer this separate monolithic piece, but that it has to be integrated into how you look at society. So while we are in our infancy, we have started Protocol with our values aligned from day one on inclusion, both in our coverage and on our team. And I'm proud that we are one of the few tech media publications that are tracking our editorial coverage on how we tell the stories of women and minorities in the tech industry. In addition, earlier this summer, we joined All Raise to commit to ensuring we have women voices in all of our events. So let me give you 3 specific examples of how I believe that tech media covers matters in the cause that Mosaic is playing. The first is around the topic in tech around media and marketing and social media. Last month, Protocol senior reporter Janka Ruckers did a story about how Netflix is reinventing its social media marketing by actually developing tech channels specific to identity groups. They launched one called Strong Black Lead, an outlet for celebrating Black films and TV shows. Protocol was one of the only people to actually cover the people who created that and why they chose to create that audience segmenting. The second, and I feel strongly of this as a technologist having moved to media, is about user experience. One of my favorite early Protocol stories was on Tony Reed, the vice president of Amazon Alexa experience and devices. By telling her story first as a speech pathologist, and now who is deciding on the user experiences for Alexa, we recognize that women in particular user experience matters a great deal to the technology industry and to the experience that we as users will have of technology. We have to tell their stories. And the last is the segment of tech media and the stories that we need to tell around tech founders and the employee experience. I think after the killing of George Floyd and the important social justice reawakening, Protocol has done a lot of reporting on these broad statements from tech leaders about their support for the movement. But we are consistently focusing on now, 6 months later, on the actions that tech companies can take. So for example, Izzy Lepowski's story on the civil rights organization Colors of Change, their efforts to stop racist content from spreading online is a tech story. It is a tech media story, but it is also a power center story. And one that we were surprised and pleasantly surprised to found a very large audience in the tech media space. We need diverse women to see themselves in these stories, to envision themselves in these industries. So how can you, as participants in Mosaic and also in policy and tech, play a role? The first is help us tell these stories. When you choose to take your breaking news or perspective to media organizations, share the stories that are not just of the largest FANG companies, CEOs, who happen to all be men. Choose outlets that want to actually tell the stories. The second is location. Yes, we need to be hiring more women in Silicon Valley in tech, but we also need to recognize that if tech is a power center, it doesn't just reside on the coast. We at Protocol are committed to telling the tech stories from across the country, across all subsegments of tech. The last is that while STEM education is key and the policy around that is key to telling the diversity, and someone having come from education technology, I believe strongly in it. But we really need first jobs and stories about people in those first jobs, about women and people of color in those first jobs. And those include now, thanks to open source technologies, not just software engineers, but graphic designers and UX, UI and marketing operators and data researchers. And we have to actually be telling the education story of how those career paths look in order to change that. And last, in my new home of tech media, my last is that if you believe in the role that tech media can play in a crowded space, I hope that you'll support media organizations that are attempting to do this work. Congratulations again on the launch of Mosaic, and I look forward to partnering with you in the future. Thanks, Crystal.
Thank you, Tammy. Wonderful remarks. And we really appreciate you being here with us. And we look forward to working with you moving forward. I think there's a lot of great things we can do together. I get to move us now to the panel discussion. You get to hear from some very wonderful professional women who are doing some amazing work in this space. If you have a question, I forgot to say this, please feel free to put it in the chat and we will try to get to all of your questions at the end of the session. So that's the fun part. So I'm absolutely excited to hear from these women, and you have their bios in your agenda as well as on our website. Our first speaker, and this is not in any particular order, but this is just how I'm introducing them, is Dr. Beth Bovino. She is the U.S. Chief Economist at S&P Global Ratings Service. The Wall Street Journal recognized Beth Ann as the most accurate forecaster of the U.S. economy in 2013. She holds a PhD in economics from Columbia, and her dissertation was entitled Essays on Race and Discrimination in Financial Markets. We also have Jewel Burks Solomon, who is head of Google for startups in the U.S. Jewel is a successful entrepreneur and businesswoman, having successfully completed an exit of her startup, ParkPick, in 2013, and is an HBCU graduate. I always have to say that since I am one as well. Next, we also have Dr. Rhonda Vonshay Sharpe, who is founder and president of the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race, a new think tank on equity, working to ensure that policy research addresses the economic, social, cultural, and political well-being of Asian, Black, Hispanic, Native American, and multicultural women. She's also the former president of the National Economics Association. Thank you all for being with us today. So let's get to the first question. As we sort of talked about earlier, I had in my remarks, and Tammy illuminated in her wonderful keynote discussion, the lack of diverse voices in these fields of economics and technology, it's a troubling phenomenon. But we want you to help us frame, why should we even care about it? Why should we care that there's this disparity? What do you think is the reason behind it? And what do you think we need to do to change that narrative? And we'd love to also hear about what you're also doing in your spaces individually to address these issues. So let's start with Rhonda. Dr. Sharpe.
Thank you, Crystal. And thank you, Tammy, for letting me say, one, presenting numbers that were what Wiser is advocating for is the disaggregation of data. So Crystal mentioned that we are a research think tank that focuses on Asian, Black, and I presume we should be saying Latinx, Indigenous American, and multiracial women. And part of the reason we do that work is because you will often read stories or studies about women, and they are not talking about me, Crystal, or Jewel, right? That who they're actually talking about are white women. And so one of the things that we recognize is very important as we're talking about this diversity and inclusion, and so I'm really excited to see Mosaic doing this, is that we want to have those voices there, but we also want to see them disaggregated. So we really encourage people not to use the term women of color unless you've defined it first. I often find that in studies, people will say, they'll be talking about Black and Hispanic women, and then they will say women of color, but it's not the broader definition of women of color. So some of the work that we are doing is, one, we're partnering with Howard University, which has been awarded the American Economic Summer Training Program. Howard is the first historically Black college to host the program, and they're also the only HBCU that has a PhD in economics. We are partnering with them to provide what are called inclusive peer, on-site, and distance mentoring, which will be 3-year mentoring partnerships with the alumni of the program at Howard. So that's one of the things that we're doing that directly will influence this pipeline for economists. But in terms of why it matters to have diverse voices, and I'm going to stress diverse voices and not hues, is what we're hoping is when we're bringing in diverse voices that we're bringing in different lived experiences. And it is the difference in the lived experiences that are going to influence policies and make sure that you increase the likelihood of having policies that address the most vulnerable. And you can't get that if everyone sitting at the table has similar lived experiences, right? Then they really don't understand what's happening in some of our more marginalized populations. Crystal said earlier, she gave the numbers for the percentage of degrees that have been awarded to women in economics. And this is another one where it's really important to think about disaggregating the data. And I have probably been screaming this for the past 2 to 3 years. I'm going to take a step back and say it is my presidential address for the National Economics Association that started this conversation around Black women in economics. I am the person who, because I was disaggregating data and shifted the conversation from what was happening at the PhD level to what was happening at the undergraduate level, is why you see the Sadie Collective and more conversations about the experiences of Black women in economics. What I am most concerned about as we're talking about tech and as we're talking about economic policy is where folks are born. And in economics, what we're finding is about 60+% of the PhDs are awarded to people who are not Native Americans. And I should stress that even more. What's unclear is whether or not they're just here for college or whether or not they did their undergraduate work here. And the reason I think that is incredibly important is if you're not educated in the US, particularly at least high school or above, then a lot of the conversation that we're having right now around George Floyd, the conversations we're having about who should be included in the CARES Act, people don't understand the context of that because they don't understand the lived experience in the US. And so I am excited and think it matters because a diversity of lived experiences will give us better policies that help our most vulnerable.
Thank you. Thank you. Really appreciate that. Dr. Beth Ann.
Great. Thank you for having me here. This is just really wonderful. When I got the offer to speak here, I was very excited about it. And let me tell you a little bit about myself, how I was invited to speak at this group. We'll take a step back, go back in time a little bit and kind of explain. First of all, I'm an economist. I'm at S&P Global. I had some of the things that struck me when actually just listening to everybody right now, something that I remembered back in the day when I was a little girl, when you were talking about particularly, how do you bring women, and particularly women of color, but women into the fields of economics and technology. When I was a little girl, now I don't blame my mom, but my mom told me I was in first grade and I just did really well on a math test. And I came home, I was really proud of it. And my mother said, that's great, but boys are better than girls at math in the end. So of course I got very angry about this and I decided to get my PhD in economics. But when I talk about where we are in terms of women in economics or in STEM or in other fields, and particularly then you take it to a next step, women in color, we are far, far not represented. When I think about the question of diversity, when I was in grad school, I probably made up 1 out of 5% of the women that were in the economics team, in the economics department. And of course that meant you didn't have a voice at the table, you didn't have a seat at the table, and that meant it carried over in terms of level of confidence, your concern, your questions about your own ability as you were challenged going forward. Later on, when I was at S&P Global and Jason Gold was at the company with me, one of the things that we explored, which was an analysis on basically taking a look at ESG, but taking the society part of ESG and doing something on that. And what we wanted to focus on at the time was, at the time, this is a few years ago, the labor force participation rate, which is now even lower. Back then it was at a 40-year low. And as an economist, that meant lower long-term potential growth for the United States. Bringing people back in the workforce meant more productivity for the economy, more income, a bigger income for the people who joined the workforce, and of course that meant more for their family. The economy would grow, the pie would get bigger. We wanted to focus, and what we looked on at the time was looking at women in the workforce, because we saw a decline in female participation rate. We just focused on women. We did not go into a breakdown of demographics in terms of Black women or Latino women. We looked at just women. What we found at the time was that if we brought women back to the workforce in general, to levels that we had seen in 1990 when we were at the peak, near the top of the labor participation rate of the 22 advanced countries, the United States would be at that time, as of, I guess we did it 2 years ago, would have been $1.6 trillion bigger, or that would have meant $5,000 for each man, woman, and child. We analyzed this and we looked at some of the factors that were at play in terms of why this could be. Education is certainly a factor. You know, we even wrote in our report, how many Alberta Einsteins or Carla Sagans have you seen in STEM, or Rosie the Riveters, for that matter, in technology, in manufacturing world these days. But that's not all. Some of the things that we looked at were some of the obstacles that women have, also making choices about what they decide to do in education, whether it would be decide to go into economics or the such. A big factor of that was indeed taking time off for a child or other family member. But another thing that matters significantly as well, that goes into the time off penalty that women get when they have to, not just the first 3 months not the first 3 months of having the child and leaving the workforce, but later on in life, taking the kid to a soccer practice or a doctor's appointment. And that actually extends to elder care as well. Women do the largest share of the workforce. I would take this further and extend this for Black women as well. Indeed, what we see, and when we look at the female participation rate, Black women actually have a higher participation rate in the compared to white women. Actually, it's a bit higher, not much so, but a little bit higher. But what we have seen in terms of wages, in terms of this goes to the seat at the table, having that seat at the table into making these decisions for the economy and for businesses as well, is that we found that Black women still, at this point in time, when we look at wages, Black women get 20% less than white women in the workforce. If you do a comparison by overall, Black women to Black men make less than, the figure I have is here, make 10% less as well. So what are the reasons behind this? These are the factors and the demographics that we need to look into further on. I can stop there and pass it back to you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. We love data. Thank you so much for that. Jewel.
Sure. And again, thank you so much for having me today. I wanted to continue a thought that Dr. Sharpe shared about the lived experience and that being so important. And in my world, in the technology industry, it being so important to product development. And that's the area where I see the biggest opportunity for diversity to really come into play is the development of the products that we use and experience every single day. One of my colleagues, Annie Jean Baptiste, just released a book that I think speaks really well to this, which is called Building for Everyone. And the key themes in that are around making sure that you are not just considering the points of view and the experiences of people, but that those people are actually a part of the development of products. There are some real world examples that if anyone has ever experienced a faucet, electronic faucet not turning on immediately, the reason if you have dark skin is because the people who tested those faucets and the machine learning around that recognition did not have dark skin. And so those are just a real world example of the ways in which we can be led astray, not just by the technology, but by the fact that there weren't diverse people, and even in that example, diverse skin tones built into the testing process. So that's something that I care a lot about. And as I coach entrepreneurs, I try to get them to think about that it's not just a matter of who is in the C-suite in an organization, but it's also a matter of who is part of the development and testing of the products that we bring to market. So that's one thing I wanted to raise. And then the other thing is just the importance of diverse entrepreneurs, diverse builders and particularly Black women, seeing problems that the general population may not be able to see. And one great example of this that I've seen in the past several months is, and kind of leads into, I know the conversation we'll have around policy, but in some ways where we all, rush to figure out what would we do in this COVID environment. I saw Black women entrepreneurs make incredible strides in the businesses that they run, to solve problems in ways that only they would have been able to see. So one example that comes to mind is an entrepreneur here in Atlanta, Jasmine Crow. She has a company called Gooder, which is food rescue. In a matter of a few days, when she realized that young students who typically rely on school lunch for their hot meals in any given day would not be receiving that as the schools closed down, she pivoted her business to do delivery in partnership with Atlanta Public Schools to those students who would not otherwise be receiving hot meals during the day. So that's just one example of the ways in which I think, as we think about supporting and elevating entrepreneurs and people of color in the STEM fields, we are also, that work is going to trickle down into communities where they live and work. So those are just a few thoughts that I wanted to add to this particular part of our dialogue.
Thank you so much. Very important point. It's I could share some experience. I used to work in the food industry and food access, not the industry, but with a nonprofit on food access. And there was always a conversation around grocery store sightings and why certain people wanted grocery stores in certain areas, but without having diverse conversations and diverse experiences at the table, it was hard to make the policy work with the implementation until we solved that problem. But once we did, it certainly opened up the door for a broader conversation. So I do appreciate your remarks. Let's move to question number 2. And it's sort of related, on everybody's mind, there are probably 3 major issues right now: COVID-19, obviously, the economy, and probably the election. But we're not getting into the election today. We will focus on the economy. When we're looking at the businesses that are closing their doors, possibly forever, there's an overwhelming number of minority and women-owned businesses, mainly who are closing due to COVID, mainly due to lack of access to capital. CBS News had a startling headline, which said basically up to 90% of the minority and women-owned owners were shut out of the Payment Protection Program, which was a part of the CARES Act, which was designed to support small businesses. And looking at how those dollars were distributed, do you think it would have made a difference if there were more diverse voices at the table in constructing that piece of legislation, whether it was around the legislation or maybe around the implementation of the legislation? And how do you think those voices might have helped to change the outcome that we see now, and what could be, this may be too much, but what needs to happen moving forward, and answer any parts of those questions that you'd like. We'd love to start with Beth Ann, if you don't mind going first.
Sure. So first, I want to applaud the government for moving so quickly and getting the stimulus out there. They moved with the Paycheck Protection Program, which I did some research on. It got out. It took them 7 days, I think, for the first round to get out. Now, but with speed comes challenges, and I'll just focus on some of the issues that I came across when I looked at the PPP analysis, when the data that was available. And to your point, in terms of did it reach minorities, small business owners, minorities, Black women, women of color? That's a very good question. The data that was available was very hard to really dissect about who actually got it. But what we did find on the aggregate data that we were allowed to find, that while they moved quickly and they acted decisively in getting the money out there, what we found is that it missed the targets. It had some of the targets that they hoped to reach. For example, the industries that were hit hard by social distancing. You mentioned a few. We're talk about accommodation and food service, or food services in restaurants. You can even add education and healthcare, for example. We're hit hard by social distancing, and what we found, just by industry, what we found was that those industries that were much more hit by social distancing, who saw the most job loss, got a smaller share of the pie. Those industries with less hit by social distancing got a much bigger share. Now, that complicates things. The other thing that we noticed in the Paycheck Protection Program was that the size of the loans themselves, this is in the first round, were much larger than. So to give you an example, I believe that in terms of PPP, the first round, the average size of the loan that was approved was about 200,000. For a small business sometimes has a bank account that could be maybe $20,000. So we didn't think it was making the mark in terms of reaching those smaller businesses, those mom and pop shops that were of need. Now they improved in the second round. It got, the size of the loans got much smaller, 50,000. But I think there would be a way in terms of trying to target those people and those industries. Those industries that were hurt by social distancing could have been more effective. And if they had an angle in terms of reaching out to women-owned small businesses or Black women who own small businesses, might have been even a stronger impact in the end.
Thank you. Rhonda.
Oh, I was expecting to hear from Jewel. I was like, wait. So I'll answer the first part. I don't think that having different voices would have mattered on the policy side. I think in terms of the way the policy was structured, that was probably solid. I think where the difference matters is in implementation, and I think this is often the case, that we will see policies that are race or gender, ethnicity, and even income neutral, but it is the people on the other side who have to implement them where the problem comes in. So I remember a lot of the conversation around small businesses may not have a relationship with their banks. And if you didn't have a relationship with your bank, it was a huge hurdle in terms of getting your paperwork completed. And so to me, what you really wanted was people on the banking side who understood what a small business is, and that depending on the small business is going to dictate the kind of relationship that they have with you. So if we think about salons and barbershops, which often are a pillar in Black communities. So I think here where I am, there's one street not very far from my home, and there are probably easily, and this might be exaggerating, but probably not, I would say in probably 3 blocks, there are easily 5 to 6 barbershops and beauty salons. So if you think about having that space closed down and not having whomever they bank with understand how they operate, the fact that when you remove them out of this space, that you're not just shutting down this barbershop or beauty salon, but you've actually removed a pillar out of the community, because when their clients come in, if there is a restaurant that's owned, you're going there to get your snack while you're waiting. If there's a small little store, a bodega that's near, you're going there. So not having these salons and barbershops be able to open, you actually are disrupting the livelihood of whole communities. And I like to think, what we know is code word. So when these communities get depressed, they become ripe for revitalization, which we all know is code word for gentrification, right? And who gets moved in and who gets moved out and who gets moved in. So for me, I don't think it would have changed the policy structure. I think this is instances where we want banks to make sure that their employees understand who are small business owners and why they may not have had a relationship with the bank to actually complete their paperwork.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we had a question on that very issue, so you answered it. We're going to now, Jewel. Oh, there you are.
Yep, sure. So I was also going to make a comment about the implementation being the real key here, and the banking relationships is what we saw. In my work, I work primarily with early stage entrepreneurs, and many of them don't have a long-standing relationship with a bank just because their businesses are very new, or it's at this point been quite transactional. And so the big learning for them was that they have to have those banking relationships in order to be on the list as far as being able to navigate something like this that comes about. The other comment I wanted to make here is that I think it's very important for policymakers to work with technologists and tech companies for something like this, where it would have been great for that first round if there were tighter connections to some of the fintech companies that could have helped in facilitation of the dollars. So those are a few things that come to mind. But one thing that I will say is that early on, based on the relationships and conversations that I was having with entrepreneurs, it was clear that many of them would not be able to access PPP for a number of different reasons. And so we did use that information to kind of formulate what we ended up doing as a response for this year and all the things that have happened this year. But we did launch a fund specifically for Black founded companies in the US because we saw that they were getting hit the hardest in a number of different ways. And so we were happy to be able to support in that way with our Google for Startups Black Founders Fund, direct dollars, cash awards to companies in our network. And the intention and the hope was that that would be helpful to them as they figure out how to survive this year, but really helping them to thrive on the other side. And our additional hope is that it's catalytic to other companies coming in and filling those gaps in similar ways. So lots to be done on the implementation side, but to Beth Ann's point, I do think it was great that things moved quickly, but we next time around hopefully can be more helpful bridging the gap on the tech innovation side as it relates to the implementation.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat, but I think we're gonna, yeah, okay. So here's a question, and you guys will probably, you ladies, sorry, could probably figure this out a little bit better. The question is really around, is there a problem with actual banking and who they serviced? Like they mentioned a big bank versus a community bank or a city or rural areas. So like a Bank of America versus a community banks in city versus rural. What about the lack of diversity and inclusion in banking? Do the banking practices of these large banks have an impact? They're trying to get a fuller picture of how those systems interact. And anybody can answer, whoever would like to answer that question.
This is Beth Ann. In terms of the question of, let me just make sure I get the question first clearly. I do think that, first of all, I did want to point out, Joel had mentioned it, and actually both did. One of the reasons why I think that the second round of PPP had more impact, smaller loans, more breadth in terms of who it reached, was because they opened the type of banks that were used. It was no longer I think there was like 10 big banks in the first round, maybe a few more, and then it opened it up to many community banks. Maybe some of the work that Joel had mentioned might have caused that discussion to happen, make that happen. But anyway, that was one of the reasons why it was so successful. In terms of lack of diversity and inclusion, I can only guess, and maybe my colleagues on this call would have a little bit more information about that as well. I would suspect that there could be a very much a kind of a story. It's an economic story. I guess it's called assortative mating, meaning what likes to be around likes, and that would be an example in terms of people like to hire people like them. whether it's a white man wants to hire a white man or so on, or the diversity in terms of wanting to work with someone of the same color or same gender could very well be at play, whether it's kind of implicit, not known, but that could certainly be a that could be one of the factors that is at play. I will stop there, but I just wanted to mention that briefly.
So I'll chime in that on the backside of that and say, I think that's a really good example of the economic aspect of that, but there's also the historical context that we're forgetting. And that is historically in the US, banks have not always been kind to folks who, one, didn't have lots of money and who weren't white. And my schoolmate, Benga Ajalori, who is at the Center for American Progress, has been doing a lot of work on rural populations. And I think we tend to associate those populations with being poor. Earlier during the summer, I was on a call with the NAACP, and this was really about folks getting PPP. And there was the churches, like it was someone from a church who was saying, I think she was in rural Eastern North Carolina, just this conversation, the struggle in terms of the relationship with the bank, right? And so I don't think that it is a single story of just diversity and inclusion within the banks, but it is also being mindful of the historical context and the ways in which banks have not always treated those who were Black, perhaps women, and didn't have money fairly. And that will also impact the ways in which you think about doing business with banks. So as Joel said earlier, it'll be very transactional, right? I'm not coming in to have a conversation with you because we know that there can be discrimination with respect to the rates of loans, the type of loans that you're offered once someone sees you. Now, I failed to say something, and every time Beth Ann says something, it reminds me to think that I'm a math major as an undergrad, and most of my training is in math and engineering. And then at the PhD level, I am interdisciplinary, econ and math. And one of the things that I always find troubling in these spaces, and so Tammy, I would say this to you, is it's not necessarily who we're speaking to, but it's the stories that we choose to tell. And I think even in this space, right, that we want to make sure that we're not always telling the stories from a deficit base, that we want to make sure that we're not always telling stories for the ways in which spaces are bad. When spaces, if that's the only story that you hear is how bad something is, nobody wants to be a part of that. So as we're thinking about creating inclusion in these spaces, as we're thinking about diversifying the voices, we want to also make sure that we've got voices who are having positive experiences in tech space. I had a great experience as a PhD student in economics. It took me years to come into spaces and talk about that because so many of my peers had bad experiences. So I just want to say, I am that tech girl who's also in econ, never was told that I was not supposed to be in this space, had always been taught by either women or Blacks. I was 26 at Stanford before I heard someone tell me that as a Black girl, I shouldn't be doing math or engineering. And I was like, y'all should have told me that a long time ago. I'm 26. I've been doing this for a minute, right? Like, I'm good in this space. And never, did I ever hear that at home. So I just wanted, to add that in to be mindful of the deficit-based conversations. And we can't forget the history when we're talking about these relationships.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. We don't often hear the other side or the positive stories. I absolutely agree with you on that. And we're going to be very mindful of that at Mosaic when we're telling the stories of our participants and how they're kind of moving through our process as well. So thank you for that. I think we're going to move to our final question. And this is kind of a question structured on just your personal reflections. Mosaic is just getting started and we're super excited about it. And we think it really can make a positive impact. And we're wondering what your thoughts are, and maybe either way, if something like this had existed for you when you entered your career, when you started your career path, do you think this would have been something that would have been useful to you then? Or not, or something that's maybe useful to the next generation. However you want to frame it, but we want to get your take on, from your personal reflection and your journey and your work and your path forward, what your thoughts on a project like this being available to you. So let's start with Jewel.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to use the opportunity to underscore something that Rhonda just mentioned about the need for more positive stories and not leaning so much into what we hear all the time, which unfortunately the statistics around women in tech and Black folks in tech, and particularly Black women in tech, are quite depressing. But I really think it's important for us to elevate those people who have been able to overcome those obstacles and do incredible work. And it's why I wanted to make sure you all heard about Annie Jean Baptiste and her work building for everyone. It's why I wanted to make sure you heard about Jasmine Crowe and the great work that she's doing. It's why we supported 76 Black-owned businesses through our Black Founders Fund. And I'm happy to share the link so that you all can know those businesses and what they're doing. So I do think that that is critically important for us to shift the narrative less to what's wrong and more to what's right, and make sure as a collective we are standing behind and in support of the great folks that are doing work on the ground, and why I think the work that you all are doing at Mosaic is so important. And I'm excited to be now in the family, and hopefully here to be able to support additionally what all you're doing. And I think one thing that was mentioned that I think is so critical is the storytelling piece, and the founders and the technologists and the economists knowing how to tell the stories, communicate with policymakers. So that's something that I think will be really incredible and transformative in the industry. So certainly think that if this had been around, 5 or 6 years ago when I was building my company, I would have jumped at the opportunity, and really happy that you all are here today to help this current day group to be able to tell their stories and lean into each other in a powerful way.
Thank you, Beth. We're running up on about 2 or 3 more minutes. Sorry, ladies, we ran over a little bit, but Beth Ann.
Okay, I'll try and keep it short. In terms of my personal reflection, actually, I do want to have to say something on what Rhonda said. She made a very good point. I forgot one of the things, my dissertation was on two reports, Black-owned banks at the turn of the century, and I looked at redlining, and I found analysis that showed that discrimination, and basically we saw it statistically, discrimination still existed, and this was not too long ago in this analysis. So I'm very glad that Rhonda brought that point up. In terms of how I would see, one of the things that when I was in grad school, one of the few women in my class, I felt very alone. I don't know how people would, I felt like a fraud. I felt like they were going to figure it out, that I shouldn't be here. It took me a long time to actually get through school. I finally found one mentor, Professor Dan O'Flaherty from Columbia University, who basically actually helped me get through. So I see this, I suspect the Mosaic Project would be something that would bolster, first would be the mentorship involved, the impact that it could have to help young women, Black women and Latinas get through many hurdles that they'll face. I think would be, I would have found it so useful. I think they will too.
So let me just say, oh my gosh, Beth Ann, Dan is actually, my first job was at Barnard in Columbia, and Dan and Linda Barrington actually put that together. So that's so funny, small world.
We got to talk.
Yes, so I will say for me, I don't know that Mosaic as its mission would have changed for me coming out. I finished in 1998, and I suspect economists were being spoken to, but I wasn't paying attention to them in the way that I pay attention to them now. So I don't know that it would have changed my path then. My research think tank, I didn't come to this with money. I used my own money to leverage this. And it is one of the biggest challenges that I have. I can't get the media to have a conversation with me in general. They only want to talk to me when it's stuff Black. And I think Beth Ann and I can talk about this. Our training as economists, at the base is all the same. You don't have to just talk to me when it's a Black issue or a woman's issue, even though I wish you would talk to me when it's about Asian, Black, Hispanic, or Native American women, because that's our space. So from that perspective, I think Mosaic will be incredibly helpful. And Clark, I just remember her last name, is asking this question about, it seems like there was a lot of talk and very little action. And what I'll say to her is, I think that you're dead on. And most of the conversations that we're having, we keep forgetting that it is easy to talk about it. And Tammy even said this in her presentation about watching these tech companies and their statements, but paying more attention to what they're doing. There is something about lip service that we're incredibly comfortable with, but holding people accountable, we're not. So that's one side, you know, having and I won't use the word empowered, but feeling like you've got nothing to lose by making somebody walk their talk is not where most of us are. And I think the other part of that is, without the data, people don't want to hear you, right? They don't believe your story unless you've got data to back it up. And that's one of the things that we're really working to do, is to partner with organizations who don't know where an economist is, where we can provide consulting services to help them get the data that they need that backs up the narratives of their folks. So Clark, you are dead on. So much talk because we're just not willing to make people walk their talk, and that's on us. That's something that we have to change. And I think we're hearing that around this presidential election, right? Making sure whoever wins next, if it happens to be Biden, to make sure that Democrats are going to be accountable, in particular to the Black community.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. We are a little bit over time, but we wanted to make sure everyone knew that thank you to all my speakers. You guys were really wonderful and made some outstanding points. And we are hopeful here at Mosaic that we're going to push the button and push the narrative on the policy discussion so that we can get to some action. Inside the chat box, there are links to the Mosaic Project, as well as application. We're accepting application for new participants. So if you know of someone or someone's in your company that you think might benefit from this training, please feel free to get them to apply. Also, we're starting new. So if your company is interested in maybe supporting this project as we move forward, please reach out. We'd love to make a connection there. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate your time today. And unless I've forgotten something, thank you for joining us, and we're done. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us, Crystal.